Sigismund III Vasa was a king who could command armies and rule 2 kingdoms, but he couldn't control the medical condition that slowly destroyed his life. He suffered from severe priapism, episodes of long, painful, completely involuntary erections that appeared without any desire or stimulus. These attacks struck him in the middle of councils, ceremonies, and diplomatic meetings, leaving him bent in pain and unable to continue. Over time, the condition broke his authority, isolated him from the court, and helped cost him a crown. Sigismund III Vasa was a ruler shaped by 2 crowns, 2 cultures, and a political world that expected from him absolute control, yet his life would be determined by a medical condition his era could neither explain nor treat. He was born in 1566 into the union of Sweden's King John III and Catherine Jagiellon, the Polish princess whose lineage tied him directly to one of the most influential dynasties in Central Europe. From childhood he moved between 2 identities, receiving a Catholic education from Jesuit tutors in his mother's chambers while growing up in a Swedish Protestant court. This upbringing produced a reserved, disciplined young man fluent in several languages and trained to navigate competing factions long before he reached the age of power. When the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth elected him king in 1587, his rise appeared logical. He was young, educated, politically flexible and carried the dynastic legitimacy Polish nobles valued. 5 years later he inherited Sweden as well, becoming one of the rare monarchs of the early modern world who ruled 2 kingdoms simultaneously. But as his political responsibilities expanded, something inside his body began to act in ways he could not understand. The first signs appeared quietly in the early 1590s, brief, unwanted erections that lasted longer than normal and carried a strange internal pressure. At first he dismissed them as stress from managing 2 states separated by distance, religion and constant diplomatic tension. These episodes soon grew longer, more painful and more unpredictable. What Sigismund confronted was ischemic priapism, or rare vascular disorder in which blood enters the erectile tissue normally but becomes trapped inside without a way to drain. In healthy physiology, arousal causes arteries to fill the corpora cavernosa, after which veins release the blood and the organ softens. In ischemic priapism, the venous outflow fails, the veins remain closed, the blood stagnates, oxygen levels drop, the tissue swells beyond its natural limits, and intense pain develops as internal pressure rises. The erection becomes rigid, immobile, and deeply painful, and without intervention it can last hours. For a monarch of the 16th century this was catastrophic. Medicine had no concept of circulation, William Harvey's discoveries were still decades away, and physicians worked with theories based on bodily humors. They attempted to reduce the episodes using methods available to them: cold compresses packed in snow, tight bindings meant to calm excess heat, opiate mixtures to dull sensation, herbal poultices of belladonna, and occasional bloodletting. None of these addressed the vascular failure at the core of the disease. At best they slightly shortened attacks. At worst they left the king waiting in agony for the blood to drain naturally. The condition struck without warning. Sigismund might be reading documents, speaking with advisors, or preparing for a ceremony when he felt the first internal tightening, a warmth, a deepening pressure, then sudden rigidity accompanied by growing pain. Within minutes he became unable to sit comfortably or shift position without visible strain. As the episodes grew more frequent, he began to withdraw from meetings with vague explanations, searching for the private chamber near his audience hall where physicians worked quickly with cold cloths, compressive wraps and bitter sedatives to manage each attack. The court noticed his sudden disappearances but could not explain them, and whispers grew as nobles observed how often their king left crucial discussions mid-sentence. By the mid-1590s the disorder was no longer an inconvenience but a force altering the rhythm of his rule. Every public engagement carried the risk of interruption. Every diplomatic session became a race against time. His posture changed, his voice tightened, and his movements acquired a tension that reflected not weakness but constant vigilance, a man trained to sense the earliest signs of a crisis he could not prevent. The illness did not yet command the full shape of his reign, but it had already begun to interfere with the stability expected of a dual monarch responsible for two vast states. The years ahead would show how completely this disorder would reshape his authority, but in these early stages the problem remained concealed behind court walls, managed by physicians who lacked both tools and knowledge. Sigismund entered the next phase of his reign not as the confident young ruler Europe expected, but as a man learning that his greatest adversary was not a rival claimant, a rebellious noble or a foreign power, but a chronic medical condition capable of interrupting his rule at any moment. The illness that Sigismund III had been concealing during the early years of his reign moved from a private burden to a public problem when the first major episode occurred during a high-level diplomatic gathering in Warsaw. Until this moment he had managed his condition quietly, stepping away from councils before his symptoms became visible and relying on explanations that did not raise suspicion. But the unpredictability of ischemic priapism eventually intersected with political reality. The attack that unfolded in 1596 revealed to foreign representatives and the Polish nobility that something was wrong with the king, even if no one yet understood what the illness was. The episode began during a formal meeting with envoys from the Habsburg lands and several German principalities. These sessions required the king to remain seated for long periods and maintain a steady, authoritative tone. For a ruler with a vascular disorder defined by sudden and prolonged attacks, this environment created ideal conditions for a crisis. As the meeting progressed, Sigismund felt the familiar internal tension that signaled the beginning of another episode, a sharp increase in pressure, a loss of normal circulation, and the onset of pain. Aware that remaining seated would make the symptoms obvious, he attempted to maintain composure while the swelling continued to develop. Within minutes the pain intensified to the point where continuing the discussion was no longer possible. Breaking formal protocol, he abruptly stopped the negotiations, rose from his seat and informed the envoys that he had to leave immediately. The envoys, unfamiliar with the king's condition, interpreted the sudden departure as confusion, instability, or a loss of physical control. Reports written later that day by several diplomatic observers described the interruption as unusual, disruptive, and inconsistent with the demands of royal office. None of these reports named a specific illness, but all reflected the same concern. The Polish king appeared unable to complete a standard political session. Sigismund retreated to the private chamber near his apartments where his physicians attempted to manage the attack. They followed the same procedures they had been using for months: cold cloths packed with ice to slow swelling, tightly wrapped bindings to stabilize the tissue, and strong medicinal mixtures intended to dull the pain long enough for venous drainage to resume. The treatment was slow and often unpredictable. In this instance the episode lasted long enough to force the cancellation of the remaining business scheduled for that day. While the king remained behind closed doors, the consequences of his abrupt withdrawal spread through the castle. The Polish nobility, who depended on a stable monarch capable of guiding diplomatic strategy, recognized that a serious issue had emerged. Foreign envoys waited for hours without explanation, then sent cautious but concerned accounts to their courts. Because the Commonwealth operated on a political system that relied heavily on the personal presence of the monarch during negotiations, even a single unexplained interruption signaled vulnerability. The king's absence demonstrated that critical discussions could be derailed at unpredictable moments, raising questions about his long-term capacity to govern two states simultaneously. In the weeks following the event, the atmosphere around Sigismund changed. Advisors began scheduling audience sessions more cautiously, limiting the duration of meetings and preparing substitutes who could step in if the king had to withdraw again. Members of the Senate and the nobility quietly debated whether the episode reflected physical weakness or political indecision. Foreign envoys, uncertain how to interpret what they had witnessed, approached subsequent meetings with greater hesitation. None of these reactions contained accusations, but all carried the same underlying message: confidence in the king's stability had shifted. For Sigismund, the consequences were immediate and personal. The illness that had once been an internal struggle began shaping the daily structure of his rule. He grew more cautious about long ceremonies, more guarded in council sessions, and increasingly aware that each public appearance carried the risk of another attack. His confidence suffered as he realized that he could no longer guarantee uninterrupted leadership. The pressure to appear composed and authoritative at all times conflicted with the unpredictable nature of his condition. By the end of this period, the monarchy had reached a turning point. The diplomatic interruption of 1596 marked the moment when the private medical disorder crossed into the realm of state affairs. The illness did not yet define his reign, but it had revealed itself to the political world surrounding him. And while the court attempted to maintain the appearance of normal functioning, everyone involved understood that the stability of the Commonwealth now depended on a king whose physical condition could undermine him at any moment. The months following the public diplomatic interruption marked a shift in how Sigismund III functioned as a ruler. The illness was no longer an event that occurred behind closed doors. It had become a variable that shaped daily governance. The court reacted first. Advisors began shortening council meetings, reducing ceremonial obligations, and preparing secondary officials who could continue discussions if the king was forced to withdraw. These adjustments were presented as administrative reforms, but those who worked closest to Sigismund understood that they were responses to the unpredictability of his condition. Every schedule now required flexibility. Every event included a contingency plan. Sigismund attempted to maintain composure, but the strain of navigating an illness without any reliable treatment progressively altered his behavior. He approached long ceremonies with caution, aware that extended periods of standing or sitting increased the likelihood of an episode. He avoided unnecessary gatherings, preferring brief, controlled environments where he could monitor early symptoms. This change in routine did not escape notice. Members of the Senate reported that the king appeared increasingly restrained and tense, speaking less than before and relying more heavily on written notes. Foreign envoys noted that meetings with him had become significantly shorter, and that complex matters were often redirected to advisors instead of being addressed directly. The nature of ischemic priapism contributed directly to this decline. Because the condition could begin without warning and escalate within minutes, Sigismund lived in constant anticipation of symptoms. The earliest sensations, internal warmth and tightness, triggered immediate concern. The onset of pain forced him to retreat. Knowing that an attack could strike during any public responsibility weakened his confidence and reduced his willingness to engage in unpredictable or extended negotiations. Even routine state functions became sources of anxiety, and this tension shaped his presence in ways that could not be hidden. At the same time, the illness created uncertainty within the political elite. The Commonwealth operated under an elective monarchy, which meant that noble factions always looked for signs of strength or weakness in the king. A ruler unable to manage extended discussions risked being interpreted as indecisive or physically compromised. Although Sigismund never disclosed the nature of his condition, rumors took root. Some believed he suffered from a chronic abdominal disorder, others speculated about a nervous ailment, a few suggested spiritual punishment. Without clear information, the political imagination filled the void, and each interpretation eroded confidence in his authority. By 1597 these perceptions began shaping high-level decisions. Nobles debated whether the king's absences would weaken Poland's position in negotiations with Sweden, where political resistance to Sigismund's rule was growing. Advisors questioned whether he could effectively coordinate military planning on the eastern frontier. Even routine internal matters became more complicated, because the monarch was no longer consistently available for prolonged consultation. The structure of the Commonwealth required a king who could guide extended deliberations and maintain stability among competing magnates. Sigismund's condition made this increasingly difficult. The illness also influenced his personal demeanor. He became more withdrawn, less approachable and more formal than before. Those who interacted with him noted a visible change. His posture remained rigid during councils, his tone flattened, and his responses became more measured. This behavior was not the result of emotional detachment but a practical response to pain. Remaining composed while navigating early symptoms required deep concentration, and the need to avoid public collapse limited his willingness to engage in spontaneous exchanges. Even in moments when he attempted to appear relaxed, the underlying tension remained clear to those around him. The physicians at court faced their own challenges. They continued to rely on the same limited methods, none of which offered a preventive solution. Their role shifted from attempting to cure the illness to managing its consequences. They monitored the king closely during long sessions, prepared the private chamber for immediate intervention, and adjusted medicinal mixtures in hopes of shortening the duration of attacks. Although their presence provided temporary relief, it did nothing to slow the progression of the disorder. Sigismund understood that each episode carried the risk of tissue damage and that repeated attacks could worsen over time, adding another dimension to his anxiety. By the end of the decade the pattern had fully formed. A monarch expected to maintain dominance in a vast political structure was being constrained by a medical condition beyond the knowledge of his time. The illness was not yet destroying his reign, but it was steadily limiting the extent to which he could act with the confidence and visibility demanded by two kingdoms. The erosion of authority did not occur suddenly, it unfolded gradually, shaped by a combination of physical unpredictability, political pressure, and a growing awareness within the Commonwealth that their king was living under constant internal strain. As Sigismund moved into the later years of his reign, the impact of his illness shifted from a private burden and occasional disruption into a force that shaped the entire political landscape of the Commonwealth. The earlier episodes, once seen as isolated interruptions, had evolved into a predictable pattern that senior nobles could no longer ignore. The king's inability to remain physically stable during extended negotiations altered how decisions were made, how alliances were formed, and how power was distributed among the magnates who governed alongside the monarchy. The situation worsened because the Commonwealth relied heavily on the personal authority of the ruler. Although the state had elected kings and powerful nobles, the monarch remained essential for unifying divergent interests. When Sigismund began withdrawing more often from state meetings, the gaps created opportunities for ambitious magnates to press their own agendas. The absence of the king during long deliberations enabled factions to grow bolder, especially those already skeptical of Sigismund's dual claim to Poland and Sweden. His silence in moments requiring decisive intervention gradually strengthened the idea that the state was operating without a consistently present monarch. His illness intensified during this period. The frequency of attacks increased, the pain escalated, and episodes sometimes lasted long enough to force the cancellation of entire days of planned activity. Physicians reported a noticeable decline in the speed at which blood drained naturally, leaving Sigismund weakened for hours afterward. At times he required days of reduced activity to recover fully. These extended periods of limited mobility disrupted both domestic and foreign policy. Matters requiring prolonged discussion, military funding, legal reforms, negotiations with nobles, were repeatedly postponed or delegated. The reliance on intermediaries deepened the perception that the king was losing direct control over governance. This decline did not remain confined to the Polish side of his rule. His already fragile position in Sweden, contested by powerful Protestant nobles, became even more unstable. Opponents used reports of his sudden interruptions and reduced visibility to argue that he lacked the physical and mental strength necessary to govern effectively. They framed his illness as evidence of weakness at the center of power. These arguments increased resistance to his authority in Stockholm and strengthened factions that preferred a more stable leader. Although the exact nature of his condition was unknown to them, the pattern of disruptions offered enough material to undermine his legitimacy. Inside the Commonwealth the pressure intensified. The nobility, seeing opportunities in the king's limited availability, pressed harder for privileges and concessions. Same sessions, already known for their volatility, became even more unpredictable when Sigismund could not remain present long enough to manage conflicts between factions. His attempts to maintain order through written instructions or shorter appearances could not fully compensate for the absence of sustained personal leadership. Nobles accustomed to lengthy debates viewed these abbreviated sessions as insufficient, and the more radical among them used the disruptions to challenge royal initiatives and delay reform. The illness also reshaped Sigismund's personal interactions with his court. He became increasingly isolated, limiting contact to a smaller group of trusted advisors. His schedule grew narrower as he attempted to create predictable conditions that would reduce the chance of an attack during critical events. This isolation further weakened his authority. A king rarely seen and frequently absent from public duties inevitably lost influence, regardless of intention or competence. Even those loyal to him found it difficult to maintain confidence when they could not depend on his presence. The stress resulting from the condition accumulated over time. Each attack reminded Sigismund of his physical limitations, and each forced withdrawal confirmed that he was losing the ability to control the narrative of his reign. Historical accounts from the period describe him as increasingly tense, cautious, and reserved. These descriptions reflect not only psychological strain but the practical reality of someone who feared experiencing a debilitating episode in front of the state's most powerful figures. The uncertainty surrounding his health created an additional burden for the monarchy, forcing Sigismund to navigate both political conflict and the constant risk of physical failure. As the decade closed, the erosion of his authority was no longer subtle. Magnates acted more independently, factions positioned themselves for greater influence, and foreign powers observed the weakening of executive leadership within the Commonwealth. Although Sigismund continued to perform his duties, the illness dictated when and how he could govern. The combination of political pressure, medical unpredictability, and the gradual withdrawal of the king from extended public responsibilities established the foundation for the next and most damaging stage of his reign, the moment when the illness would collide with a full political crisis. By the final stage of Sigismund III's reign, the illness that had followed him for decades no longer functioned as an intermittent disruption. It had become a permanent factor that shaped the remaining years of his life. The episodes of ischemic priapism, once separated by months or weeks, appeared with increasing frequency. Physicians recorded that attacks began without any recognizable pattern and lasted longer with each passing year. The combination of vascular swelling, trapped blood, and prolonged tissue pressure created a cycle of exhaustion that Sigismund could not overcome. His ability to recover after each episode diminished, and the intervals during which he could act as a fully present monarch grew increasingly narrow. The political world around him responded to these changes with a mix of caution and calculation. Many nobles had spent years adjusting to a ruler whose participation in extended deliberations could not be guaranteed. But as the king's absences became more pronounced, factions began planning state matters with the assumption that the monarch would not be available. Advisors reshaped the structure of public events so that Sigismund's role required minimal physical strain, often limiting him to short appearances or ceremonial endorsements rather than active engagement. These modifications did not arise from disrespect but from necessity. The unpredictable nature of his condition required careful management of every circumstance in which he appeared. The illness affected more than his public responsibilities. It reshaped his private routines in ways that left him isolated from the environment he was meant to lead. Sigismund spent increasing amounts of time in his private chambers, either recovering from an attack or attempting to prevent one by avoiding prolonged exertion. Only a limited circle of attendants and physicians had access to him during these periods. Their records describe days when the king remained largely confined, emerging only briefly to manage the essential functions of monarchy. As the episodes grew more severe, even these short intervals became difficult to maintain. By this stage the physicians could do little more than attempt to manage each crisis with the same limited tools: cold compresses, pressure bindings, and medicinal mixtures designed to ease pain rather than treat the underlying vascular dysfunction. They understood that repeated episodes placed the king at risk of long-term tissue damage and systemic complications, But without knowledge of circulation or effective surgical intervention, there was no path toward recovery. Their role had shifted entirely towards stabilizing him long enough for essential tasks to continue. The growing isolation created a broader symbolic problem. A monarch whose presence was central to maintaining political cohesion had become someone the public saw less often, and when he did appear, signs of fatigue and strain were increasingly visible. Long ceremonies were shortened or avoided, formal councils became briefer and more rigidly scheduled, and military planning was delegated almost entirely to trusted commanders. Even routine matters of governance, legal confirmations, diplomatic receptions, administrative oversight, were reorganized around the limitations imposed by his condition. Attempts to preserve stability could not fully counteract the effect of his decreasing availability. Many nobles interpreted his absence as a sign that the monarchy was losing influence relative to the magnates. International observers wrote that the Commonwealth appeared increasingly dependent on internal factions rather than on the king himself. Although Sigismund remained intellectually capable and continued to make key decisions when able, his physical inability to maintain continuous leadership altered the balance of authority in ways he could no longer control. As the end of his life approached, the chronic strain of the illness produced a cumulative decline in his health. Repeated episodes of ischemic priapism can lead to permanent circulatory impairment, tissue damage, and systemic weakness, and over decades the consequences of these attacks became evident. Sigismund's energy waned, his resilience decreased, and periods of full recovery became rare. By the time he entered the final months of his reign, the illness had reshaped both his body and the structure of his rule. When Sigismund III died in 1632, his passing was not marked by dramatic collapse or sudden catastrophe but by the exhaustion of a man who had fought a chronic disorder for most of his adult life. His death revealed the lasting effect of the illness on his political legacy. Historians who later examined his reign noted that many of the weaknesses often attributed to indecision or temperament were better understood as consequences of a condition that limited his stability at crucial moments. His illness did not destroy the Commonwealth, but it transformed his ability to act within it, leaving behind a reign defined as much by physical constraint as by political ambition. In the end, Sigismund III's story became a rare example in European history of a monarch whose authority was steadily reshaped by a medical condition that his era could not diagnose or cure. His life demonstrated how a chronic disorder, unpredictable, painful, and poorly understood, could influence not only the individual who suffered from it but the political world that depended on his presence.